What if the name you have carried all your life was not simply a family label, but the surviving echo of an invasion? What if the word written on your passport, spoken in school registers, signed on official documents, and passed quietly from parent to child, once belonged to a knight who crossed the English Channel beneath the banner of war? Most people rarely question where their surname began. It feels ordinary because it has always been there. But some names are older than the towns in which their modern bearers live. Some were carried through battles, royal marriages, rebellions, castle sieges, religious upheaval, and journeys across oceans. And some first entered Britain in the company of the most ambitious conquering force medieval England had ever seen: Beaumont, Percy, Neville, Montgomery, Howard, Clifford, Mowbray, FitzAlan, Talbot, Berkeley, Vere, Mortimer. These names still appear in Britain, Ireland, North America, Australia, and far beyond. Yet behind them lies a story that is far stranger than a simple tale of French nobles conquering England. Because the Normans were not originally French, they were the descendants of Vikings. They did not merely win a battle in 1066. They replaced an aristocracy, transformed the English language, built castles across the landscape, altered the structure of land ownership, pushed into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, and created family dynasties whose influence survived for centuries. But here is the mystery. Carrying one of these surnames does not automatically mean you descend from a Norman lord. In fact, one of the greatest surprises in this story, that millions of people with no Norman surname have Norman ancestors, while some people carrying famous Norman names may not descend from the original medieval family at all. So before you dismiss your surname as just another name, ask yourself this: what if it has been preserving a 1,000-year-old clue without ever telling you the full story? Before we cross the channel and uncover where these names truly began, subscribe to UK Bloodlines and tell us in the comments which surname brought you here. By the end of this documentary, you may look at your family name very differently. To understand the Normans, we have to travel back to a time before Hastings, before William the Conqueror, and before Normandy itself existed. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe lived in fear of Viking raiders. Longships appeared with terrifying speed along coastlines and rivers. Monasteries were attacked, towns were burned. Kings paid tributes in the hope of avoiding destruction. These raiders came from Scandinavia, but they were not a single people moving with one purpose. They were warriors, traders, settlers, mercenaries, and adventurers searching for land, wealth, and opportunity. One of them was a leader remembered as Rollo. The exact details of his origins remain debated, but by the early 10th century he had become powerful enough to force the Frankish King Charles the Simple into an extraordinary agreement. Around the year 11, Rollo received territory along the lower River Seine in exchange for loyalty and protection against further Viking attacks. The land became known as Normandy, the territory of the Nothmen. What happened next was one of the fastest cultural transformations in medieval history. The descendants of Viking settlers adopted Christianity. They began speaking a form of French. They married into local aristocratic families. They learned the political customs of the Frankish world and built a disciplined feudal society. Within a few generations, the people once feared as raiders had become castle builders, landowners, church patrons, administrators, and heavily armed mounted warriors. Yet the old Viking ambition did not disappear. It was refined. The Normans became something new, neither fully Scandinavian or simply French. They combined the adaptability of settlers with the discipline of an emerging military aristocracy. Their knights fought on horseback with devastating force. Their rulers developed networks of loyalty based on land and service. Their churchmen recorded grants, marriages, disputes, and inheritances. Their builders raised fortresses that controlled roads, rivers, towns, and valleys. By the middle of the 11th century, Normandy had become one of the most powerful duchies in Western Europe. At its centre stood William, Duke of Normandy, a man whose survival had never been guaranteed. Born outside marriage, he was mocked by enemies as William the Bastard. His childhood was marked by assassination plots, feuds, and rebellion. Powerful nobles believed they could control him or remove him. Instead, William survived. The danger of his early life shaped him into a ruthless and patient ruler. He learned to reward loyalty, crush rebellion, and turn personal weakness into political strength. By adulthood, he controlled Normandy with a combination of fear, military skill, diplomacy, and carefully managed alliances. Then, in 1066, an opportunity appeared that would change Britain forever. Edward the Confessor, King of England, died without a direct heir. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English nobleman, was crowned king. William claimed that Edward had previously promised him the throne, and that Harold had sworn to support his claim. Whether those promises were truly made remains debated. What mattered was that William treated Harold's coronation as betrayal. Across Normandy, ships were built, armor prepared, horses gathered, supplies loaded, and warriors recruited. This was not simply a raiding expedition. It was a campaign designed to seize a kingdom and hold it. In September 1066, William crossed the Channel. He brought Norman lords, Breton allies, French knights, archers, infantry, craftsmen, priests, servants, and ambitious men seeking land. Among them were families whose names would later become embedded in British history. Yet many of these were not hereditary surnames in the modern sense. A man might be identified by the place he came from, the estate he controlled, his father's name, or a personal characteristic. Over time, these descriptions hardened into inherited family names. A village in Normandy could become a surname in England. A castle could give its name to generations. A father's given name could be preserved through the prefix Fitz, meaning son of. The Battle of Hastings is often described as a single decisive moment. In reality, it was the beginning of years of conquest. Harold was killed, but England did not simply surrender overnight. Resistance continued in the north, the west, and other regions. William responded with brutal force. Rebellions were crushed, settlements were destroyed, lands were confiscated. The old English ruling class was gradually displaced by men loyal to the new king. Within a generation, the ownership of England had been transformed on an extraordinary scale. Imagine standing on a hill above an English town in the years after 1066. Below you, wooden houses crowd around a church. Fields stretch into the distance. Then, above the rooftops, a new structure rises. A mound of earth, a timber tower, a fenced enclosure, a Norman castle. These early motte and bailey fortresses could be built quickly and placed strategically. They were military bases, administrative centers, prisons, and visible warnings. Later, many were rebuilt in stone. Their towers dominated the surrounding landscape. They announced that power had changed hands. The Normans did not simply occupy England. They reorganized it. Land was granted in exchange for loyalty and military service. Great lords held estates from the king. Knights held land from those lords. Tenants worked the estates beneath them. The system was never as simple or uniform as later diagrams suggest, but the central principle was clear. Land, power, obligation, and warfare were connected. A surname linked to an estate could become a political identity. A marriage could unite territories. A castle could defend a dynasty. A rebellion could destroy one. In 1086, 20 years after Hastings, William ordered one of the most extraordinary surveys in European history. Royal officials travelled across much of England, recording landholders, tenants, livestock, mills, woodland, fisheries, plough teams, and taxable values. The result became known as the Domesday Book. To open its pages today is to look into a kingdom still living in the shadow of conquest. It records who possessed land under Edward the Confessor and who controlled it under William. Again and again, English names disappear and Norman names replace them. It is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for how quickly power shifted, yet the Domesday Book also reveals something important about surnames. Many famous names associated with later Norman dynasties did not always appear in their final hereditary form immediately after the conquest. Family identities evolved, spellings changed, branches separated. Lands were inherited through daughters, titles disappeared and returned. A place name might be used by several unrelated people. This means that medieval surname history is rarely a straight line. It is a trail of clues. Among the families who rose in Norman England were the Beaumonts. Their name came from French place names, meaning beautiful hill. Members of the Beaumont family became powerful supporters of Norman kings and held important estates and titles. The story was not merely one of wealth. It showed how service to the crown could elevate a family, and how political loyalty could be converted into land, marriage alliances, and long-term influence. But the Beaumonts were only one thread in a much larger web. Far to the north, another name was becoming inseparable from border warfare. The Percys would eventually become one of the most powerful dynasties in northern England. Their estates, especially in Northumberland, placed them close to the Scottish frontier. That position brought prestige, but also danger. Raids, rebellions, shifting loyalties, and royal disputes made the north one of the most unstable regions in Britain. The Percys became military guardians, political power brokers, and at times dangerous rivals to the crown. Their castles were not decorative homes, they were defensive machines. One of the most enduring symbols of Percy power was Alnwick Castle. Its walls witnessed centuries of conflict and political ambition. To modern visitors, it may appear romantic, but in the medieval world it represented survival. Families who controlled the borderlands lived close to war. A disputed succession in London could trigger violence hundreds of miles away. A Scottish raid could destroy crops and villages. A noble family could rise through royal favour and fall through rebellion. The same world produced the Nevilles. Their name derived from Neuville, meaning new town, a commonplace name in Normandy. Yet in England, the Nevilles became anything but ordinary. Through land, marriage, and political calculation, they rose into the highest ranks of the aristocracy. By the 15th century, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, became known as the Kingmaker. That title captures the extraordinary power one family could achieve. Warwick helped place Edward IV on the throne, later turned against him, supported Henry VI, and became central to the Wars of the Roses. A family whose name had begun as a Norman place name became powerful enough to influence who wore the English crown. But the Neville story also exposes the danger of power. The same networks that raised aristocratic families could destroy them. Loyalty was rarely permanent. Kings feared over mighty subjects. Marriages produced rival claims. Brothers fought brothers. Cousins became enemies. Behind heraldic banners and castle walls lay insecurity. One wrong alliance could erase generations of influence. Along the Welsh border, the Norman story became even more violent. The Welsh marches formed a frontier between territories controlled by the English crown and independent Welsh rulers. Norman lords were granted extensive authority to conquer, defend, and govern these unstable regions. They built castles at river crossings, mountain routes, and strategic valleys. Their power sometimes exceeded that of ordinary English nobles. The Cliffords emerged from this frontier world. Their surname was associated with Clifford in Herefordshire, where a castle stood near the River Wye. The name itself likely referred to a crossing near a steep bank or cliff. Yet behind that peaceful-sounding description was a hard military reality. The borderlands were places of constant negotiation and conflict. The Cliffords became soldiers, administrators, and regional magnates. Their identity was shaped not simply by Norman ancestry, but by life in a landscape where English, Welsh, and Norman cultures met. Nearby, the Mortimers built an even more formidable power base. Their name came from Mortimer in Normandy. In England, they became leading marcher lords, controlling vast territories and powerful castles. Their rise offers one of the great surprises of medieval history. Through marriage and inheritance, the Mortimer family developed a claim to the English throne. That claim later passed into the House of York and became one of the forces behind the Wars of the Roses. A surname carried from a place in Normandy became linked to a dynastic struggle that would tear England apart. This is the moment to pause and consider what these surnames really represented. They were not simply names of people. They were networks of land, inheritance, military obligation, and memory. A castle could preserve a family status. A marriage could transfer an estate. A son could inherit a title, but a daughter could carry a claim into another dynasty. The surname might disappear from the highest nobility, while the bloodline continued under another name. That is why the most famous Norman surnames do not always tell the full story. The FitzAlan family, for example, carried a name meaning son of Alan. Their ancestry was connected to Breton and Norman circles, and their descendants became Earls of Arundel. Through marriage, titles, and inheritance, Their line became intertwined with the Howard family, one of the most important noble houses in English history. The Howards later became Dukes of Norfolk and held the office of Earl Marshal. Their story shows how a family could inherit the prestige, lands, and bloodlines of an earlier dynasty, even when the surname changed. The Howard name itself may not sound obviously Norman in the way FitzAlan or de Vere does, yet its medieval rise was inseparable from the aristocratic world created after the Conquest. This is one of the script's most important revelations. Norman ancestry is not limited to surnames that sound French. Family lines travelled through women, changed names, merged with English houses, and reappeared in entirely different forms. The Mowbrays offer another example of this transformation. Their name came from Montbray in Normandy. They became great landholders and held some of the highest titles in medieval England. Their descendants served kings, joined crusades, rebelled, married into other noble houses, and eventually passed titles and estates into different families. The Mowbray name survived, but the political dynasty changed shape. Then there were the Talbots. Their origins remain debated in detail, but the family became firmly established in the Anglo-Norman aristocratic world. By the 15th century, John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, had become one of the most feared English commanders in France during the 100 Years' War. To his supporters, he was a symbol of courage. To his enemies, he was a relentless military threat. His death at the Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the end of an era. The English cause in France collapsed soon after. A Norman-linked surname had become tied not only to the conquest of England, but to England's failed attempt to dominate France. If this documentary is already changing how you think about your surname, share it with someone in your family and tell us below whether your name appears in the story. Family history often begins with one person asking a question that no one else thought to ask. And if you enjoy documentaries that uncover the hidden history behind British names, subscribe to UK Bloodlines so you do not miss the next journey. The Berkeley family tells a very different story. Their power was rooted in place. Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire became the centre of a dynasty with one of the longest surviving connections between a family and an estate in Britain. The castle witnessed royal visits, political intrigue, civil conflict, and the imprisonment of Edward II. Tradition holds that the deposed king died there in 1327, although the exact circumstances remain debated. The walls of Berkeley Castle therefore preserve more than architecture. They preserve the memory of kings, prisoners, conspiracies, and survival. The de Veres also rose into the highest ranks of medieval politics. Their name was associated with Norman origins, although the precise place connection has been debated. They became Earls of Oxford and served English kings across generations. They fought in civil wars, held court offices, and remained influential for centuries. Their long history demonstrates how the descendants of conquerors became woven into the institutions of the kingdom they had once invaded. Montgomery is another surname that carries the map of Normandy within it. Roger de Montgomery was one of William's most important supporters. He became Earl of Shrewsbury and received vast lands. His power extended toward the Welsh frontier, where castles and lordships expanded Norman influence. Yet even great families could fall quickly. Rebellion, failed inheritance, and royal punishments could break a dynasty. The Montgomery story reminds us that conquest created opportunity, but not permanent security. The Normans changed England in ways that reached far beyond aristocratic surnames. For centuries after 1066, French was spoken among the elite, Latin dominated official writing, and English remained the language of much of the population. Gradually, these languages blended. Thousands of French-derived words entered English, especially in law, government, war, architecture, status, and food. Court, judge, jury, prison, parliament, crown, castle, mansion, beef, pork, and many other words reflect this legacy. Even the language spoken by modern viewers carries traces of the conquest. Food reveals the social divide particularly clearly. The animals raised by English-speaking peasants kept many of their English names, such as cow, calf, sheep, and pig. But when the meat appeared on the tables of French-speaking elites, it was often described with French-derived words such as beef, veal, mutton, and pork. The language itself preserved the relationship between those who worked the land and those who consumed its produce. The greatest Norman transformation, however, may have been cultural absorption. Within a few centuries, the descendants of Norman conquerors no longer saw themselves as foreigners. They married into English families, adopted English customs, and eventually spoke English. The conquerors changed England, but England also changed them. The same process would repeat in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. In Scotland, Norman influence often arrived by invitation as well as warfare. King David I, who ruled during the 12th century, had spent time at the English court and introduced many administrative and military practices associated with Anglo-Norman society. He granted lands to knights and nobles who brought new forms of castle building, lordship, monastic patronage, and government. Families of Norman, Breton, and Flemish origin became part of the Scottish nobility. Over time, these settlers married into Gaelic families and served Scottish kings. Their descendants became thoroughly Scottish. Names that had arrived from continental Europe became associated with Scottish history, clan identity, and national conflict. This is why ancestry in Britain cannot be divided neatly into separate boxes. A family could begin in Scandinavia, settle in Normandy, cross into England, receive land in Scotland, marry into a Gaelic lineage, and later appear in Ulster or North America. In Wales, the Norman advance was resisted fiercely. Norman lords built castles at Chepstow, Pembroke, Cardiff, and many other strategic locations. Some territories were conquered, lost, and reconquered repeatedly. The Marcher lords possessed unusual powers, but they could never completely ignore Welsh society. Political survival required negotiation, marriage, and adaptation. Over generations, Norman and Welsh families became intertwined. The conquerors were absorbed even as they expanded. Ireland produced perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. In 1169, Anglo-Norman forces crossed the Irish Sea under the exiled Irish King Diarmait mac Murchada, sought military assistance to recover his kingdom of Leinster. Warriors including Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, became involved. King Henry II later intervened, extending English royal authority into Ireland. Families such as Fitzgerald, Fitzstephen, de Burgh, Butler, and others established major dynasties, but Ireland changed them. Many descendants of the Anglo-Normans adopted the Irish language, married into Gaelic families, followed local customs, and sometimes resisted English rule. They became so integrated that later observers describe them as more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Statutes of Kilkenny in the 14th century attempted to stop English settlers from adopting Irish language, dress, marriage customs, and law. The very existence of those laws reveals how completely cultural boundaries were breaking down. This leads to one of the central truths of the Norman story. Conquest did not create a permanent, separate Norman race ruling over Britain and Ireland. It created centuries of mixing. The descendants of conquerors became English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish. Their bloodlines spread through noble marriages, ordinary families, illegitimate children, servants, soldiers, merchants, clergy, tenants, and migrants. The surname might remain, disappear, or be inherited by people with very different biological ancestry. Centuries later, these names crossed the Atlantic. During the 17th and 18th centuries, migrants from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland established new lives in North America. Some traveled for religion, some sought land, some fled debt, conflict, or poverty, some arrived through military service, trade, or forced circumstances. Among them were people carrying surnames with medieval Norman associations: Howard, Talbot, Montgomery, Percy, Clifford, Beaumont, Neville, Berkeley, Mortimer, and others appeared in colonial records. By then, most of these migrants would not have described themselves as Norman. Their Norman ancestry, where it existed, had been filtered through hundreds of years of local identity. A family might regard itself as English, Scottish, Welsh, Anglo-Irish, or Scots-Irish, yet the surname had survived another migration. In North America, the name spread again. Families moved from coastal colonies into the interior. They crossed mountains, founded settlements, fought in wars, worked farms, entered politics, built businesses, and created new branches separated from their British origins by distance and time. Later migrations carried the same names into Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and other parts of the world. This long movement helps explain why a surname first associated with a Norman village can now appear in Kentucky, Ontario, Texas, Nova Scotia, Sydney, or Auckland. But it does not prove that every bearer descends from the original noble house. Surnames could be adopted, altered, translated, inherited through complex family circumstances, or created independently in different places. Unrelated families sometimes carried the same name. A spelling fixed in one parish might change in another. Modern DNA testing has made the mystery even more compelling, but it has also produced misleading claims. Some commercial advertisements suggest that a DNA test can reveal whether someone is Viking, Norman, Celtic, or Anglo-Saxon with certainty. The reality is far more complicated. These were cultural and historical identities, not perfectly separated genetic categories. People moved, married, and mixed long before modern nations existed. Autosomal DNA, the type most commonly used in ancestry tests, is inherited from any ancestors, but the detectable contribution from a particular individual becomes smaller with each generation. After nearly 1,000 years, a specific medieval ancestor may have left no identifiable segment in a modern descendant, even though that person remains genealogically part of the family tree. Y chromosome testing traces one direct paternal line. Mitochondrial DNA traces one direct maternal line. Both can be valuable, but they represent only tiny parts of a person's ancestry. There is another remarkable possibility. If a medieval Norman noble had descendants whose lines continued successfully, that person may now have millions of descendants. The number of positions in a family tree doubles with each generation, although real family trees overlap, because distant relatives married one another. Over 30 or more generations, the potential network becomes enormous. This means that Norman ancestry may be widespread among people of British and Irish descent, even when their surnames give no clue. The opposite may also be true. Someone carrying a famous Norman surname not descend through an unbroken male line from the medieval founder. The name could have entered the family through adoption, step parentage, inheritance, non-paternal events, social association, or independent origin. This does not make the surname meaningless. It simply changes what the name can prove. Historical evidence remains essential. Parish registers, wills, census returns, tax records, manorial documents, military papers, property deeds, heraldic visitations, court cases, medieval charters, and immigration records can help reconstruct a family line. The strongest genealogies combine documentary evidence with careful DNA analysis, rather than relying on a surname alone. The Domesday Book may provide an early glimpse of a Norman landholder, but it cannot automatically connect the person to a modern family. 1,000 years of missing records stand in between. The task is to work backwards, generation by generation, beginning with known relatives. Family stories can offer clues, but memories change. Online family trees can help, but they often copy mistakes. Heraldry can be fascinating, but a coat of arms belongs to a specific individual or line, not automatically to everyone sharing the surname. Perhaps this is why surnames remain so powerful. They offer enough information to awaken curiosity, but not enough to remove mystery. They connect ordinary people to vast historical events. A name spoken today and once have been written in a medieval charter. It may have crossed a battlefield, survived a plague, passed through a marriage, changed spelling at a parish desk, travelled across an ocean, and reached a child whose family no longer remembered where it began. Somewhere in your ancestry were people who experienced the world created after 1066. Some may have lived beneath Norman rule. Some may have resisted it. Some may have married into families that arrived with the conquest. Others may have carried entirely different names that later disappeared from the family line. Your ancestry is not a single surname. It is thousands of surnames, most of them lost. That may be the most surprising truth of all. The name you carry represents only one narrow path through your family tree. Your father's surname may lead back through one line, but your mother, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, and countless other ancestors brought different stories into the same family. A person with no obvious Norman surname still descend from the Beaumonts, Percys, Nevilles, Mortimers, or FitzAlans through a maternal branch. A person named Mortimer may discover that the documented line began much later and has no proven connection to the medieval lords. So if your surname is Beaumont, Percy, Neville, Montgomery, Howard, Clifford, Mowbray, FitzAlan, Talbot, Berkeley, Vere, Mortimer, or another name linked to the Norman world, do not treat it as proof of nobility. Treat it as an invitation. Begin with your parents and grandparents. Record names, dates, places, occupations, marriages, and stories. Search certificates, censuses, parish registers, wills, and local archives. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts family legend. And if you enjoyed this journey through Britain's Norman past, subscribe to UK Bloodlines, share this documentary with your family, and tell us in the comments which surname you carry and where in the world you are watching from. Your comment may connect you with someone researching the same name, the same village, or even the same forgotten branch of history. Because in the end, a surname is not a certificate of ancestry. It cannot prove that your forefather rode beside William at Hastings, lived inside a Norman castle, or belonged to one of medieval Britain's great dynasties. But it can do something just as valuable. It can make you curious. It can lead you into archives, villages, records, and stories your family forgot. It can remind you that history is not only found in castles, battlefields, and ancient books. Sometimes it is spoken every time someone calls your name. And sometimes one ordinary word is the first clue in a story that has been waiting nearly 1,000 years for someone to uncover it.